What if I told you the figure you were taught to fear most in all of creation was once the very God your ancestors prayed to for wisdom, protection, and divine order? What if I told you that the devil, the horned villain etched into your nightmares, was not always evil, but sacred, revered, and black? This is not fiction. This is not blasphemy. This is history distorted. A deliberate rewriting of the spiritual narrative that begins not with demons but with deities. And at the center of it all stands a black god, a being of immense spiritual authority, cosmic knowledge, and divine balance, rebranded over time as the enemy of God, the deceiver, the fallen one. But fallen from where? And by whose pen? Because long before Lucifer became synonymous with evil, before Satan was spoken of in hushed tones, there existed gods in African civilizations who bore the very symbols later used to define the devil. Serpents, horns, fire, knowledge, the third eye, the tree of wisdom. These were not cursed icons. They were portals to the sacred. They were how the ancient black world communed with the divine. And yet, as monotheism rose, violent, jealous, and needing to erase the past, these gods were not only dethroned, they were demonized. Their sacred roles were inverted, their stories rewritten, their powers reframed as threats. And the people who once danced in their honor now bowed in fear to a version of them made monstrous. But who was this black god that shook the heavens before he was forced underground? Who was the being whose light was so radiant that it had to be painted as darkness? The answer is scattered in fragments, in Sumerian stone tablets, in Dogon oral traditions, in the buried temples of Kemet, and in the encoded texts of the Book of Enoch. Across the ancient world, one archetype reappears: the bearer of light, the bringer of knowledge, the challenger of tyrannical gods. And he is not white, he is not European, he is not the enemy, he is black, African, divine, and feared not because he was evil, but because he could not be controlled. To understand how this black god became the devil, we must first return to the oldest civilizations on earth. Before the Bible, before Rome, before the church claimed to own the voice of God. In ancient Kemet, the god Set, yes, the same Set later morphed into Satan, was not originally evil. He was complex, a force of chaos, yes, but also balance, a protector of Ra's solar boat against Apep, the serpent of true destruction. He embodied necessary disruption, the kind that dismantles old power to make way for the new. He was the patron of storms, foreigners, and the unknown. And in some texts, Set was not Ra's enemy but his ally, a divine guardian of the cosmic order. So what changed? How did Set the protector become Satan the enemy? How did a force of balance become a symbol of absolute evil? The answer lies in conquest. When colonizers could not kill the spirit of the people, they attacked the gods. And when they wanted to control the people, they rewrote their gods into devils. It was not enough to erase the temples. They had to corrupt the memory. And so the traits once seen as powerful became demonic. Horns became a curse. Serpents became sin. The fire of divine knowledge became the fires of hell. But the energy never changed. Only the narrative did. And that's where our story begins, not in the shadows of sin, but in the light of truth, a truth buried beneath centuries of propaganda, a truth that's been whispering in your soul every time religion told you to be afraid of what your ancestors once honored, because the devil they taught you to fear might just be the God your lineage once called divine. And if that's true, then everything must be questioned. Every sermon, every scripture, every painting, every fear. What if the greatest spiritual deception was not who the devil is, but who he used to be? The greatest trick was not that the devil deceived the world, it's that the world was deceived about the devil. Because if you trace the symbols, the language, the rituals that predate the Abrahamic faiths, you begin to see that the being now branded as the enemy once held the sacred role of liberator. The fire he carried wasn't meant to burn souls, it was meant to ignite minds. The serpent he bore wasn't poison, it was knowledge, and that knowledge threatened the very institutions that rose to power by keeping people in fear. So the God who gave wisdom to humanity became the villain in a new spiritual regime. Go back to the story of Eden, a paradise controlled by a singular God, with one forbidden tree and a woman seduced by a serpent. But ask yourself, why would knowledge be forbidden? Why would the awareness of good and evil be dangerous unless control was the true motive? In countless African traditions, the serpent is a divine teacher, a symbol of renewal, cyclical power, and cosmic awareness. In the Yoruba pantheon, Oshun's serpentine wisdom flows through waters of intuition and life. In the Dogon cosmology, Nomo, an ancestral being, was a serpent-like water deity linked to creation and divine law. These were not demons, they were guides. But when monotheism arrived, it declared one God and only one as true. All others, especially the black ones, had to be silenced or slandered. And so the transformation began. The serpent who freed Eve became Satan. The light-bearer became Lucifer. And slowly the world was taught to fear what it once revered. But the essence could not be erased. It only went underground. In African diasporic religions like Vodun, Candomblé, and Santeria, the ancient gods, Orishas, Loas, and Kisis, continued to be worshipped under layers of disguise. Catholic saints became masks. The devil became a camouflage. Colonizers forced black people to hide their deities behind Christian language, and so they did. But they never forgot. They whispered names under their breath, carved sigils into their skin, and danced their devotion in coded rhythms. The black god lived just hidden in plain sight. Now look at how the devil is still portrayed. Horned, dark-skinned, goat-footed, surrounded by fire and serpents. But peel back the fear, and what do you see? Symbols of ancient gods, horns from the fertility god Pan, a deity of nature and sensuality. Fire from the blacksmith god Ogun, a force of transformation and war. Serpents from the cosmic coils of Kundalini energy. These were not evil in origin, they were sacred tools of awakening. But when colonizers wanted to sever black people from their power, they didn't just ban the rituals, they demonized the gods themselves. And what better way to do it than to turn the most powerful of them all into the very image of evil? The devil, as you were taught, is a mirror, a distorted reflection of what was once holy. He is the black god, defanged, renamed, and feared. But the power remains. It's in your blood, in your instincts, in the visions that come when you close your eyes and remember. You feel it, don't you? That the fire inside you is not sin, it's legacy. That the serpent who winds through your dreams is not temptation, it's memory. And the more you listen, the more the image begins to crack, the chains begin to loosen. Because the devil was never the enemy. He was the first teacher. And his greatest crime was giving you the power to think. Power is dangerous when it belongs to the wrong people, not because the power itself is evil, but because it exposes the illusion. The black god they turned into the devil held a kind of power that didn't require temples, popes, or preachers. His altar was the earth. His language was vibration. His miracles weren't confined to holy books. They lived in the body, in the breath, in the firelight of ancestral memory. And that kind of power, raw, intimate, and ungovernable, terrified those who built religions to dominate, not liberate. So what did they do? They flipped the script. They called him evil for refusing to kneel, called him dangerous for empowering humanity, called him fallen for standing beside us instead of above us, but history has a way of leaving fingerprints, and those fingerprints are everywhere if you know where to look. Look at the ancient god Enki of Sumer, the keeper of knowledge, the bringer of civilization, often associated with the serpent. He brought language, architecture, healing, mathematics, gifts the gods were supposed to withhold. But Enki defied the divine council to uplift humanity. And what was his punishment? To be forgotten, replaced, misnamed, but his story echoes through time. In Kemet, that energy became Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, of writing, of alchemy. And in later retellings it became Hermes, then Mercury, then finally Lucifer. Not the horned monster, but the morning star, the light bringer, the one who dares to deliver knowledge that awakens the soul. So now ask yourself, if this black god gave humanity the spark of thought, the fire of knowing, why would he be cast down unless knowing itself was a threat? What kind of God fears knowledge? What kind of faith demands obedience without understanding? A faith that needs silence to survive, a system that crumbles when the people begin to ask. That's why this black god was rewritten as the devil, because he made people dangerous. He made them conscious. He made them divine, and no empire built on subservience can coexist with a god who teaches freedom. This is why in colonized lands the black god had to be buried beneath layers of horror, made grotesque in image, forbidden in name. His symbols were scattered, his followers punished, his likeness turned into nightmares. And yet he kept appearing, in the shadows of resistance, in the trance rhythms of drumming circles, in the rebellion of those who refused to forget. In Haiti, the Loa Papa Legba stands at the gate between worlds, holding keys, speaking all languages. Often shown with horns, with fire, with a staff, the colonizers saw him and screamed, "Devil!" But the people knew better. They knew he was the doorway, the black god who still spoke. And maybe that's why you're here. Because something inside you is stirring. Maybe the fire they told you was hell is really your awakening. Maybe the voice you've been told to silence is the memory of a god who never left. Maybe the devil is just the name they gave to what they couldn't chain, a reflection not of evil but of untamed holiness. And maybe you've felt him not in terror but in truth. The moment you start seeing through the lie, the world begins to shift. Not just the outer world, but the one within you. Because once the devil is unmasked, the fear collapses. And behind that fear you find a memory older than scripture, older than doctrine, older than the chains that wrapped your ancestors' necks in both body and spirit. You begin to feel the rhythm they tried to silence, the pulse of a God who walked among the people, not above them, who whispered to them in dreams, not dictated from a throne, a God who looked like them, moved like them, a God whose skin was black and whose wisdom was dangerous. To see the devil for who he truly was, you must return to the roots they cut from you. Go back to the sacred groves where the elders spoke with the unseen, back to the fire circles where stories became spells and breath became prayer. In these spaces there was no shame in power, no guilt in passion, no fear of knowledge. These communities saw no sin in asking questions. In fact, asking was sacred, because to ask meant you trusted your soul to hold the answer. And the black god, yes, the one they renamed Satan, was the patron of the askers, the challenger, the firebringer, the one who said, "You are not made to crawl, stand." But standing was a problem. Empires do not like people who stand. Colonizers do not like minds that question. Religions built on hierarchy cannot tolerate divinity in the common soul. So they launched a campaign not just of conquest, but of erasure. They didn't just enslave bodies, they crucified memory, turned black gods into demons, turned ancient wisdom into forbidden knowledge. And then, most cruel of all, they made you believe it was your salvation. They held up a white god and said, "He is good." They painted your gods with horns and said, "They are evil." And with each generation, the story deepened, until you feared your own reflection. Now feel that sickness in the pit of your stomach, that ache in your chest. That's not sin. That's your soul remembering. That's your spiritual DNA pushing against centuries of lies. Because deep down, something in you always knew it never added up. That the God who demanded submission through fear didn't feel like love. That the stories designed to terrify you felt eerily similar to the stories your ancestors once celebrated. Because they were. It was the same power inverted, the same energy flipped, the same God rewritten. Look again at how the devil is described. A fallen angel, bearer of light, cast down for rebellion. But rebellion against what? Against tyranny? Against obedience without truth? Against silence when justice is at stake? If rebellion is the crime, then every ancestor who fought slavery was guilty. Every prophet who spoke truth to kings was a traitor. Every liberation was a sin. But you and I both know that's not true. Rebellion is holy when the system is corrupt. And maybe that's the real reason they turned the black god into the devil. Not because he was evil, but because he would not kneel. And if he would not kneel, maybe you weren't meant to either. The moment rebellion is named a sin, obedience becomes a religion. And that's exactly what they needed to make the black god disappear. Not just erasure, but replacement. They didn't just take him out of the story. They replaced him with an enemy. They turned him into a warning, a punishment, a fear so deep that even the sound of his name would make generations shiver. And yet, beneath the fear, the memory persisted, a flicker in the dark, a whisper behind the sermon, a heat in the bones that no doctrine could extinguish. Because truth doesn't die, it waits. And the black god has been waiting. He has waited in the chants that survived under forced conversions, in the dance that looked like performance but was really prayer, in the eyes of children who saw visions no one could explain, in the elders who told stories they were forbidden to speak out loud. And through all that waiting, something sacred was preserved. Not perfectly, not openly, but faithfully. Because you cannot destroy a God born in fire, earth, water, and air. You can only try to bury him. And even then he rises. Consider this. Every time the devil appears in the scriptures, he's not killing. He's not stealing. He's not destroying. He's asking Job if his faith is real. Asking Jesus if he truly knows himself. Offering Eve the chance to open her eyes. And though they brand it as temptation, what if it was revelation? What if the serpent's whisper was the voice of a forgotten God saying, "You are more than you were told"? What if his role has always been to test, not to torture, to liberate, not to dominate? What if the devil is not the enemy of God, but the enemy of the lie? Now hold that thought and look at what replaced him. A single monolithic image of God, white, male, wrathful, enthroned, a God whose love must be earned, whose forgiveness is conditional, whose power is outsourced to institutions, to priests, to books edited by conquerors, a God who speaks through fear and governs through shame. But that's not the God of your ancestors. That's not the God who danced with you around the fire, who whispered to you through the drum, who showed up in dreams wearing your skin. That's not the God who made you in his image and never asked you to apologize for it. So why did they need to erase the black God so completely? Because he reminded you that you were divine. Because he didn't need temples or tithes to be worshipped. Because he lived in the body and the earth and sex and death and rebirth. Because he gave power freely, because he didn't demand hierarchy, because he didn't serve kings, he served the soul. And most dangerously of all, he showed you that the divine was already inside you, that you were never separate from God, only separated by lies. And now those lies are cracking. You feel it, don't you? Like something ancient stirring in your chest, a knowing that can't be unlearned. A voice that's always been there but now refuses to be silenced. That voice is not the devil. That voice is you remembering the God they tried to make you fear. And once you remember, you can't go back. You can't unsee it once it clicks. The way the devil was designed to look like everything colonizers wanted you to forget. Dark skin, curled hair, horns like the sacred rams carved into Nubian temples, serpents coiled like wisdom around the ankles of Egyptian gods, fire in his hands, not to destroy, but to illuminate. He looked too much like the gods that once walked with your people, too much like the ancestors who refused to bow, too much like you. So they made sure you feared your own image in the mirror. They made sure that when you saw the devil, you saw yourself and recoiled. But your spirit remembers what your mind was trained to forget, that the devil's imagery wasn't born in hell. It was stolen from the temples of black gods, every detail crafted to demonize what once was holy. The horns of fertility gods, the cloven hooves of forest spirits, the wings of angelic beings from Sumerian myths, the fire of enlightenment from Kundalini and Kemet, all repurposed, rebranded, weaponized. They stitched together a god of shadows from the bodies of your gods of light. And then they told you to run, and yet you kept dreaming. You kept hearing the call in places they said were cursed, in rhythms they said were profane, in visions they said were madness. But it wasn't madness, it was memory, a living thread connecting you back to the source, and that source was black. That source had power before papal crowns and cathedrals, before Bibles and colonial maps, before the name Satan was even invented. That source was raw, elemental. It didn't ask for worship, it asked for presence. That's why their new religion had to be enforced with blood, because the old ways were too alive to die quietly. So they burned the witches, they silenced the shamans, they crucified the rebels, and all the while they kept reshaping the image of the devil to mirror anything that could wake you up. Blackness, femininity, sexuality, intuition, nature. They took everything sacred and called it sin. And then they offered you salvation through obedience, through shame, through disconnection. But here's what they didn't count on. Your soul doesn't forget. It doesn't matter how many generations pass. The ember remains. And when it's time, it burns. That's why you're here now. That's why your heartbeat quickens when you hear the truth spoken plainly. That's why, even after all the programming, you still feel drawn to the very symbols they warned you about. Because deep inside, you remember that the devil was not the enemy. He was the threshold, the one who stood between ignorance and knowing, between slavery and sovereignty, between silence and speech. And now you're at that threshold too, the moment of decision. Will you keep bowing to the story they gave you? Or will you begin to reclaim the one they tried to erase? Because every step toward the black god they demonized is a step back to yourself. And no amount of doctrine can keep you from what was always yours. They always knew that to control the body, they had to first imprison the soul. So they rewrote the heavens, redrew the maps of divinity, repainted the gods, and at the center of that rebranding campaign stood the most dangerous figure of all, the black god who gave fire to the people, who told them, "You are not sheep, you are not slaves, you are creators." That god had to go, because you can't build an empire on the backs of people who know they are divine. So they took his symbols, his temples, his sacred names, and buried them beneath a new religion, one that made obedience a virtue and thinking a sin. But it wasn't enough to erase him. They had to reverse him, had to twist every attribute of his being into a tool of fear. Knowledge became temptation. Power became pride. Fire became hell. The serpent became the curse. They made sure that the very tools he once used to lift humanity would now be used to scare them into submission. And what's worse, they made you complicit, taught you to fear your own wisdom, to distrust your own instincts, to call your ancestors demons and your dreams blasphemy, all while praying to a god you were never meant to see yourself in. Because representation is spiritual power. If you can't see yourself in the divine, you won't believe you are divine. And if you don't believe you are divine, you'll accept anything. Chains, shame, silence. A god who doesn't look like you, speak like you, or move like you. A god who is always above you, beyond you, outside of you. That was the goal. To turn your birthright into blasphemy. To make the black god, the one who walked with your ancestors, who spoke through the earth and the stars, into the devil, the enemy, the deceiver. But what if the real deception was the narrative? What if the true devil was not the being who brought light, but the one who demanded darkness be called holy? The one who said, "Bow and do not ask." The one who erased the mothers from divinity, who banned drums from churches, who turned the natural world into a battleground of sin, the one who said the sacred only lives in stained glass and silent pews, not in dance, not in rage, not in the beat of your ancestral heart. Because when the black god spoke, he didn't command, he awakened. He didn't say, "Worship me." He said, "Remember who you are," and that remembering was revolution. So they called him Lucifer. They called him Satan. They said he was cast out. But cast out from where? From a throne that required silence? From a heaven that didn't include your kind? From a God who couldn't stand to share the spotlight? Maybe the fall wasn't a punishment. Maybe it was a choice to walk with the people, to descend into the dirt and whisper to the lost, "You are still holy." And maybe, just maybe, that whisper has never stopped. Maybe that's what you hear when everything else goes quiet. The devil's voice, not calling you to sin, but calling you home. If they told you the devil was whispering, they forgot to mention that he was speaking your native tongue, not the language of guilt, but the language of memory, the cadence of drums, the rhythm of breath, the scent of rain on sacred soil. He wasn't whispering evil. He was reminding you of the world before the world was taken, before the colonizers carved up the sky and declared ownership over God, before they renamed everything divine in your image as demonic. And that's the true crime. They made you believe your roots were cursed, but roots don't lie. They may be buried, but they never forget. And the deeper you dig, the more truth you uncover, because in every continent where black gods once reigned, in Kemet, in Ife, in Kush, in Congo, you find traces of the same pattern. A sacred being who brings balance through chaos, a god who walks the line between light and dark, a force that holds both the fire and the water. Not good or evil, but whole. Not a devil, but a doorway. A being too complex for binary religion, too free for systems, too ancient to be erased. Take Shango of the Yoruba, the thunderer, the god of fire, lightning, and divine justice. His symbols: axes, storms, drums, and flames. His energy: raw, masculine, electric, but righteous. Now look at how the devil is described in modern faiths. A figure surrounded by fire, feared for his power, revered for his rebellion. And yet no one speaks of Shango in church. No one tells the story of how the gods of the African world carried traits now associated with damnation. And why is that? Because it breaks the illusion. It exposes the lie. The devil, as they shaped him, is a collage of every god that colonizers feared. He is the sum total of blackness rebranded. They took Ogun's iron and turned it into the chains of hell. They took Legba's crossroads and called it temptation. They took the sacred serpent of Dambala and made it the enemy of Eden. They stole every powerful archetype that once liberated people and recoded it to enslave the soul. This was not theology. It was strategy. Because a people without their gods are a people without memory. And memory is power. That's why the stories were burned. Why the old names were punished. Why the dances were outlawed. Because when you remember, you resist. When you reclaim the black god, you reclaim your ability to define the sacred on your own terms. You no longer need permission to pray. You no longer feel guilty for seeing yourself in divinity. You stop waiting for heaven and realize you are standing on holy ground. And maybe that's what they feared most. That one day you'd stop fearing the devil and start listening. That you'd hear in his voice not wickedness but wisdom, not rebellion but remembrance. That you'd see in his eyes not fire for destruction but fire for illumination. And when that moment comes, everything changes, not because the devil was real, but because he was never who they told you he was. He was yours, and they couldn't allow you to know that. There's a reason your spirit stirs when you hear these truths. It's not because they're new. It's because they're ancient, etched into the marrow of your being long before a book told you who to worship and who to fear. And now, those buried truths are rising like smoke from forgotten altars, curling through the cracks of your indoctrination, whispering, "You were never meant to kneel in shame." The devil they gave you was the disguise, the decoy, the lock. But the key was always hidden in your own reflection. Because the moment you see yourself as divine, the entire system begins to tremble. Not the system of spirit, but the system of control. The church is built on submission. The theology written in conquest. The institutions that depended on you believing that power belonged to someone else. That holiness was foreign. That God was not black, not feminine, not you. That's why the black god had to be inverted into the devil. Because if he had remained in his true form, as protector, liberator, light bearer, then no colonizer could have ever bent your knee. So they told you the devil was pride, but they never told you that pride was the first breath of liberation. That pride is what your ancestors carried when they refused to forget who they were. That pride is what made the enslaved sing in codes, dance in secret, and worship under the moonlight when no one was watching. That pride kept the black god alive, not in cathedrals, but in heartbeat, in rhythm, in ritual. And when they couldn't kill the god, they killed the memory, or so they thought. But the memory was never gone. It was just waiting for the moment your spirit would tire of empty sermons and distant gods. Waiting for the day you'd realize that you don't feel evil, you feel forgotten. That the shame you've carried didn't come from sin but from separation. Separation from your own story. Separation from the black god who stood at the center of it. And now that story is calling you home. Not to worship blindly, but to remember consciously. Look closer and you'll see him everywhere. In the stories that refuse to die, in the symbols they told you to throw away, in the dreams where a fire burns but does not consume, in the voice inside you that doesn't beg, it dared. He lives in the questions that disturb the quiet, in the eyes of those who challenge the narrative, in the children who refuse to conform, in the mother who speaks to the wind and the healer who reads the stars. The devil, they say, but really it is the black god reborn in every act of spiritual defiance. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You begin to reclaim the images, you begin to resurrect the names, you begin to walk with the clarity that what they demonized was not darkness, but depth, not evil, but freedom. And what they feared was not the devil's power, but yours. Because once you remember who the devil used to be, you begin to remember who you were before they told you to be afraid. The devil they warned you about is the God they stole from you. Let that settle. Let it echo past your logic and into your bones, because if the one you were taught to fear was actually the guardian of your freedom, then fear itself becomes the prison, a tool, a muzzle. And every time you were told not to ask, not to touch, not to look, what they were really saying was, don't wake up, don't trace the lineage, don't notice that the same God who gave you your rhythm, your fire, your tongue, your boldness, now wears horns in their books, and yet still calls you home in your dreams. It's no accident. Colonization was never just about land. It was about the soul. If they could convince you that your gods were devils, then they wouldn't need chains. You'd chain yourself. You'd reject your own power. You'd trade your ancestral fire for someone else's forgiveness. You'd kneel to the image that conquered you and curse the one who birthed you. That is not salvation. That is spiritual inversion. And it has worked for centuries, but the illusion is unraveling now. The silence is breaking because you've begun to remember, not with facts, but with feeling. You don't need to be a scholar to sense the lie. You feel it when they preach about love, but their God burns with vengeance. You feel it when they condemn rituals that feel more sacred than any pew. You feel it when they ask you to shrink, to hush your voice, your hips, your joy, because God prefers restraint. No, that's not your God. That's the edited God, the colonial God, the rewritten light. And every time your soul recoils from that image, it's the black God whispering, I'm still here. He is the wild wind they tried to box, the blaze they tried to tame, the echo in the mountains of Ethiopia, the beat in the heart of the Congo, the serpent carved into the temples of Kemet. He is not a villain. He is the reminder that you are more than the labels you've been given, more than the sins they invented, more than the rules they enforced in the name of order. The black God does not offer order. He offers truth. And truth is messy. It burns, it collapses false thrones, it sets the captives free, and that's why they turned him into the devil. Because truth cannot be domesticated, and neither can you. Once you remember, once you reclaim, once you walk into the fire and realize it does not consume you, it reveals you. Then their spells break, their fear tactics fail, and suddenly you are dangerous again. Not because you hate, not because you seek vengeance, but because you finally see through it all. And what you see is that the devil never existed. Only the story did. And behind that story was a stolen God, your mirror, your ancestor, and now that you've seen him for who he is, you don't need permission to follow. You just need the courage to stop running. Because he was never chasing you, he was waiting. What happens when you stop running from the image they told you was evil, only to find your reflection staring back? That's the turning point. That's the terror they never prepared you for. Not hellfire, not damnation, but the realization that the devil they drew in crimson and ash was never the enemy. He was the suppressed version of your godhood, screaming from beneath centuries of lies. Because if the devil is a liar, what does that make the ones who told you your gods were devils? Who lied first? It starts to dawn on you the greatest trick wasn't the devil deceiving the world, it was the world deceiving you about who the devil really was. That he wasn't some horned beast born to corrupt, but a being twisted into a monster to erase the memory of your divinity. A figure forged out of fear, clothed in symbols that once meant sovereignty. Horns that used to crown gods. Fire that once signified enlightenment. Snakes that represented healing and balance. They took every sacred image and turned it into a threat, then told you to worship their image instead. And you did, not because you were weak, but because you were taught to survive, taught to obey, taught that to question was to fall. But now you're falling anyway, out of the illusion, out of the spell. And in that fall, you see the cracks in the stained glass stories. You notice how every demon wears the features of your ancestors. How every sin looks suspiciously like freedom. How every rebellion echoes the same cry, I am not yours to own. Because this is not just a spiritual lie, it is a political one, an imperial one, a psychological war cloaked in theology. They didn't just demonize black gods, they used that demonization to justify everything else. The conquest, the slavery, the erasure. After all, if your people worship the devil, then their lands could be stolen, their names stripped, their tongues cut, their bodies branded, their histories erased. All in the name of salvation. This is what happens when spiritual genocide is sold as righteousness. But here you are, standing in the ruins of that system, and you're beginning to rebuild, not with bricks and crosses, but with memory and fire, with stories that predate the Bible, with chants that echo back to the Nile, with visions passed down in blood and dream. You are not inventing a new truth. You are resurrecting an old one they hoped you'd never find. And that truth is this. The devil they gave you was just the black god repackaged in chains. But you're breaking those chains now. You're learning to look past the mask, to see the brilliance hidden in the shadow, to hear the love embedded in the roar, because that roar is yours. It's your voice rising after centuries of silence. It's your God rising through you, and nothing terrifies the architects of control more than a people who have remembered their power, especially when that power was once called the devil. They warned you about summoning spirits, about calling upon energies you don't understand. But they never told you the spirits already live in your DNA. They never told you the black god they feared might be encoded in your heartbeat. That the so-called devil isn't something you summon. It's something you remember. A force buried deep in your bones, in your grandmother's lullabies, in the sweat of your ancestors' resistance. And once remembered, it doesn't possess you, it empowers you. It gives you back the parts of yourself that were stolen. That's the danger. Not demons, but dignity. Not spells, but sovereignty. You were never meant to be a spectator in this spiritual war. You were meant to be the storm. But they tamed the storm, told you to be still. Told you the only safe power was the one that flowed down from their pulpits, their robes, their whitewashed heavens, and every time you danced too wildly, loved too loudly, questioned too deeply, they called it rebellion, or worse, possession, as if fire in your belly was a sickness, as if wanting freedom made you evil, but you were never sick. You were never fallen. You were only waking up. And now you're wide awake, looking at the sky with new eyes, seeing how the constellations align with your old story, how the symbols they claimed as theirs were borrowed, no, stolen from the temples of Nubia and the scrolls of Thoth. You realize your people had cosmologies when theirs were still chasing shadows. Your God walked among you, not above you. Your God bled with you, sang with you, whispered through wind and flame. Not once asking for worship, only awareness. And that's why they had to make him the devil. Because a God who walks with the people doesn't need a church. A God who speaks in riddles and rhythms doesn't need scriptures. A God who teaches that you are divine doesn't leave room for middlemen. So they created a replacement. A God who sits on a throne while you beg at his feet. A God who offers mercy only after confession. A God who sends his son to die while asking you never to question why. But your God never asked for blood. Only truth. Only courage. Only memory. And now, memory is flooding back. Not in neat doctrine, but in chaotic waves, in goosebumps, in tears, in dreams where you're flying over deserts and jungles, led by a figure who glows blacker than obsidian. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. Because you know, you recognize him. Not from a book, but from before you were born. He is the archetype, the keeper, the fire, the so-called devil who came not to tempt but to remind. So when you speak his name, do it without fear. Not because he is your savior, but because he is your mirror. The part of you they tried to bury beneath centuries of fear, guilt, and whitewashed grace. Say his name with reverence, not to bow, but to rise. Because rising was always the point. And they couldn't let you rise. What if every time they said beware the devil, what they really meant was beware yourself? Not your ego, not your shadow, but the self that remembers, the self that commands storms, the self that sings in ancient tongues and bends time with intention. Because that's the version of you they've always feared, the you that's whole, that doesn't need their absolution, their validation, their polished savior. The you that carries the black god in your chest and doesn't flinch when someone says that's evil, because you've come to know better. You've come to feel what they never wanted you to feel, your own magnitude. And when you start walking like you remember, everything shifts. People get uncomfortable. They say you're arrogant, dangerous, heretical. They say you're channeling darkness. But what they're really saying is you're no longer controllable. You're no longer digestible. Because you're not here to be understood. You're here to be remembered, to crack the spell, to raise the God who was buried beneath centuries of shame and call him by his true name. Not devil, but defender. Not demon, but disruptor. Not evil, but exile. You begin to see that hell was never a realm, it was a metaphor for forgetting. And heaven was the memory of yourself before the lie, before the switch, before the divine was divided into safe and unsafe, white and black, acceptable and forbidden. And it's no surprise which half they placed your God in. They buried him under fire and called it damnation. But fire was always purification. They covered him in horns, forgetting that horns were once symbols of divine wisdom. They called his realm the underworld, forgetting that the underworld was where souls were healed, not tortured. So here you are, walking back into the underworld on your own terms, not afraid, not repenting, but listening. And when you get there, it's quiet. No screams, no pitchforks, just presence, just power. And in the middle of that silence stands the being they told you never to face. The God who wasn't slain, just slandered. He looks nothing like their painting. His skin holds galaxies, his eyes carry timelines. His voice It doesn't threaten, it confirms. You were never lost, he says, just lied to. That's when it hits you. The devil wasn't the one corrupting your soul. He was the one they corrupted to keep you from your soul. He was the scapegoat, the decoy, the mask thrown over the original so you'd never recognize the God in your own skin. Because what colonizers could conquer a people who saw themselves as divine? What empire could survive people who knew their stories predated Genesis, who remembered that the first gods were black and the first sin was erasure? And now you're done being erased. You're done apologizing for what your soul knows to be sacred. The devil they gave you was just your God in exile. And the moment you call him home, not with fear but with reverence, the spell breaks. You do not fall. You rise. You rise with fire in your veins and memory in your breath. The moment you rise, something ancient rises with you. It's not just rebellion. It's remembrance. Not just resistance, but return. And it doesn't come as noise. It comes in stillness. The kind of stillness where truth begins to vibrate under your skin, where you feel the presence of the one they called the adversary. And instead of fear, you feel recognition, familiarity, as if you've met before, long ago on the other side of silence. Because you have, before the edits, before the Gospels, before evil was branded onto everything that looked like you. Now the veil is paper thin. You see how the word Satan was never a name, but a role. Ha-Satan in Hebrew meaning the opposer, the challenger, the one who asks dangerous questions. And isn't that what you've become? The opposer of lies, the challenger of systems, the questioner of doctrine. They fear him because he does not obey. But what if disobedience was sacred? What if the adversary only opposes what oppresses? They told you to worship meekness, but your God was never meek. Your God was bold, wild, free. So when you feel that power moving through you, it's not possession, it's reconnection. You're not being tempted, you're being activated. The flame that once lit your temples is relighting inside your spine. And suddenly every whisper from your ancestors makes sense. The songs they sang, the chants, the rituals, the rhythms that made no sense to the empire now sound like coded instruction. Instructions to wake up. Because you were never meant to stay small. You were never meant to trade your thunder for obedience. They told you God cast Lucifer down for pride, but forgot to mention that pride was the first step toward autonomy, that the fall was actually a descent into matter, into embodiment, that the light bringer did not fall, he came down, like a seed. And every time you rise, you honor that descent. Every time you remember your own worth, you reverse the curse. And yes, it's dangerous, not to your soul, but to the systems that depend on your spiritual amnesia. Because a people who remember their true God are impossible to manipulate. You stop begging for salvation when you realize you were never damned. You stop bowing when you realize divinity is your birthright. You stop fearing death when you remember the underworld is where ancestors speak. And the so-called devil, he was never your enemy. He was the map back to your fire. So you light a candle, not for protection but for guidance. You speak his name, not to summon but to reclaim. And when others flinch, you do not. Because you know better now. You know the story was flipped, that the devil was the disguise they wrapped around your God so you'd never find your way back to your... But you did. You burned through the lie. You stood in the mirror and saw your own eyes looking back from the face of the forbidden. And in that moment, you didn't feel evil. You felt whole. Wholeness is what they tried to keep from you. That's why they needed a devil. Because as long as there's a devil, there must be a savior. As long as you believe you're broken, you'll keep crawling to someone else's altar for healing. But what if the devil wasn't the enemy? What if he was the missing piece? The piece they removed so you'd forever feel incomplete. So you'd stay fragmented, divided against yourself. Holy or damned, light or dark, God or beast. But the black god never played by that duality. He was always both. You see it now, how the myth of the devil was their crowbar, prying you apart from your own center, turning your instincts into sin, your intuition into rebellion, your sacred rage into a flaw. They taught you that to be safe you must be small, that holiness required silence. But your God spoke in thunder. Your God moved in chaos. Your God shattered false order and called it creation. He was not meek. He was not mild. He was not the sheep. He was the lion, and lions don't kneel. So now the mask has slipped. You no longer see a devil. You see distortion. A lie etched into scripture, painted into cathedral ceilings, passed down from pulpit to parent like a poisoned inheritance. And you see why they needed it. Because without the fear of the devil, their control collapses. The priest loses his pulpit, the empire loses its leash, and the people begin to rise. Not in rebellion, but in remembering, because that's the greatest threat of all. A people who remember who they were before the lie. You've begun remembering. You remember that your gods didn't ask for your shame. They asked for your power, that they didn't demand belief. They demanded alignment. They weren't jealous. They were mirrors. They showed you what you could become, and that terrified the ones who wanted you tame. So they made gods into demons and demons into doctrine. They called fire evil because they knew fire could free you. But now the fire is back in your hands. You speak names your ancestors whispered in chains. You walk paths that were paved in secret. You touch your own darkness and find gold instead of guilt. And in that gold you see him, the black god with flame in his hair and thunder in his chest. He does not ask for worship. He does not promise paradise. He simply stands, as you are now standing, whole, undivided, not waiting for heaven, creating it. That's what they fear, not rebellion, not even revenge, but regeneration. That from the ashes of their lie you would grow something too ancient to burn. A faith they can't colonize, a God they can't rewrite, a you they can't control. And when they ask you who you follow now, you don't give them a name, you give them a mirror. And the mirror doesn't lie. It shows them the face they tried to erase, the features they painted with horns and flame, the truth they buried beneath doctrine and chain. When you hold up that mirror, you're not just reflecting them. You're reflecting the entire system, the whole architecture of control that required your self-denial to survive. It was never about theology. It was about psychology. About convincing you that your roots were rotten, that your power was perilous, that your reflection was the face of rebellion, and rebellion meant damnation. But rebellion was your first act of love, love for the self that refused to die in the silence, love for the ancestors who sang even when shackled, love for the God who never demanded your worship, only your return. That love was called Luciferian. That love was called blasphemy. That love was painted in red and banished from the holy books. But it survived in the drum, in the breath, in the stories that couldn't be burned. You carry it now, not like a burden, but like a torch. And that torch sets fire to every lie that ever named your nature as evil. You realize now, evil was just a label slapped on anything they couldn't tame. Anything that wouldn't bow. And your God, He was unbending, he was untamed, so they made him unholy. And you bore that shame in your skin, your name, your tongue. You learned to fear yourself, to pray against your own instinct. But now prayer has changed. You don't kneel, you don't beg, you speak. You speak in the language of the old ones, the tongue of the gods who gave you memory as scripture and breath as ritual. And when you speak, the room shifts. Because your words carry weight. They echo across timelines. They remind the bones of every listener that they were once royalty, that before the cross there was the Ankh. Before the Savior there was the self. Before sin there was sovereignty, and that memory, it doesn't need permission to rise, it just needs silence to break. And that's what you've done. You've broken the silence. You've named the lie. You've looked into the mirror of the so-called devil and found not a monster, but a blueprint. Not a curse, but a crown. Not an enemy, but the version of you they feared would wake up. And here you are, awake, fully. Not just spiritually, historically, culturally, cosmic. You are no longer looking for a god to rescue you from darkness. You are becoming the God that walks through darkness without fear. And when they try to remind you of hell, you laugh. Not out of mockery, but because you've already been there. You were born into it, raised in it. You stared into the flames and found your own reflection. And now that you know the truth, hell can't hold you, it never could. Because hell was never fire, it was forgetting. And you, beloved, are unforgettable, unforgettable. That's what they could never erase. Not the rituals, not the rhythm, not the roaring silence that echoes through your bones every time you question who you really are. Because deep down, even when they stripped the language, beat the memory, mocked the skin, you still remembered. Something stayed, something ancient, something holy that refused to die. And that's what this story has always been about. Not damnation, not salvation, but survival. The survival of a God they tried to rewrite, recode, reframe as your enemy. Because he was the one power they couldn't own. You understand now. Why they gave you Jesus but never told you about Osa. Why they gave you heaven but never mentioned the field of reed. Why they told you to fear the fire, but never that the fire was your rite of passage. Because if you knew your God was the Black One who rises from the underworld, not to drag souls down but to resurrect them, you would stop begging. You would start building. And when Black people build their own spiritual frameworks, entire empires tremble. So they tethered your spirit to guilt. They taught you to confess instead of confront, to fear instead of feel, to run from your own darkness instead of understanding its language. But you don't run anymore. You walk straight into the center of it, into the caves where they said demons live, and you find altars, altars older than their churches, symbols older than their creeds. And on those altars you find pieces of your, not broken, just hidden, covered in dust, waiting for your return. And when you place those pieces back into your chest, the devil vanishes. Because the devil was never a being. He was a border, a boundary line that marked the edges of your spiritual real estate. Don't go past this, they warned. It's dangerous out there. But out there was your origin. Out there was your medicine. Out there was your God, unshaven, unbaptized, unashamed. And when you cross that boundary, when you step into the forbidden, what you find is not darkness, but depth. Not evil, but energy. Not sin, but sovereignty. Now you are dangerous. Not because you seek vengeance, but because you see clearly. You see how they turned stories into shackles, how they turned your God into their scapegoat, and how they taught you to fear the very thing that could set you free. your memory. Because once you remember, the spell is over. Once you remember, the lies lose power. Once you remember, your voice stops shaking and starts singing. Not a hymn, but a war cry. Not for blood, but for truth. You sing because you are no longer bound by borrowed gods, no longer controlled by guilt, no longer afraid of a fire that was never meant to burn you, only to baptize you. You sing because the devil was never chasing you, he was calling you back. Back to the truth, back to the mirror, back to the black god whose story is not over, but just now awakening through your lips. And now, you see the whole map. The lie was never just about religion, it was about memory, about story, about who gets to define the divine and who gets damned for daring to look like it. You understand now that the devil wasn't a person, he was a projection, a shadow stitched together from the stolen symbols of your gods, a mask placed over black divinity so the world would fear it, and you would fear your. But the story couldn't hold, because even the most perfect lie fractures under the weight of truth. And that truth is this: the devil you were warned about was the face of your original God, reversed, demonized, dismembered. Because to colonize a people, you must first colonize their cosmology. You must turn their protectors into predators, their rituals into witchcraft, their leaders into devils, and that's what happened. The horned god of the forest became Satan, the black man of wisdom became Lucifer, the serpent of rebirth became the symbol of sin. They flipped every code, and then they handed it to you in a holy book and said, "This is the truth." But now you know what truth tastes like. It's bitter at first, like betrayal, like losing your childhood gods, like realizing your prayers were aimed at a throne built on the bones of your ancestors. But then, it sweetens, because beneath the betrayal is power, beneath the grief is gold, beneath the devil is divinity, not the sanitized commercial god they packaged for mass worship, but the raw, radiant, roaring force that lives in the marrow of your bone. The God with fire in his chest and freedom in his blood. The God who doesn't ask for submission, but invites you to remember. So you remember. You remember the ones who came before the cross, the ones who called lightning their language and silenced their sanctuary. You remember that before sin there was story, before punishment there was power, and before the devil there was the black god. The God who held both light and shadow, sun and soil, creation and destruction, not because he was confused, but because he was whole. And wholeness is the greatest heresy of all in a system that profits from your fragmentation. But you are done being fragmented. You gather every piece of yourself they scattered across doctrines. You lift the mask off your God's face, and you do not flinch. You do not bow. You do not whisper his name with shame. You say it with fire, with pride, with purpose. Because the devil was never evil, he was just edited. And your God was never gone, he was just renamed, buried beneath sermons and centuries until now. Now he rises, through you, through every breath that remembers, through every truth that breaks the lie, through every voice that dares to ask, what if the devil they warned you about was the black god they stole from you? And what if he's not waiting to be worshipped, but to be recognized in your own reflection?